The world your mind is already creating. Introduction. Everything you experience has passed through one place first. Before events take shape, before circumstances solidify, before outcomes appear in the visible world, they are organized within the mind. Not as conscious plans, but as patterns, structures of expectation, interpretation, and emotional meaning. Your life is not forming itself randomly around you. It is being shaped from the inside outward. The mind is not simply a tool you use when you think. It is the lens through which reality is arranged. What you call your world is the result of how this lens has been set over time. This setting is rarely intentional. It develops gradually through repetition, through the thoughts you return to, through the meanings you assign to experience, through the emotional responses that become familiar enough to feel like the truth. Every time you think about something, the mind does not stop at thought. It moves immediately into evaluation. Is this safe or unsafe? Possible or unlikely? Worth pursuing or better avoided? That evaluation influences your decisions, often subtly, often without conscious awareness, and decisions repeated over time become direction. These inner movements do not stay inside, they organize perception. They influence decisions, they shape behavior without announcing themselves, and behavior, repeated, becomes the environment. This is the mechanism most people never see. They believe the mind reacts to the world when in fact it is constantly selecting, filtering, and reinforcing it. The mind decides what is relevant, what is threatening, what is possible, and what is expected, and reality conforms itself to those decisions with remarkable consistency. Not because reality is obeying your thoughts, but because your thoughts quietly guide your choices, and your choices, accumulated over time, construct the world you live in. This work is inspired by esoteric philosophy, modern psychology, and the timeless idea that consciousness precedes form. This is why two people can stand in the same situation and live in entirely different worlds. The difference is not circumstance, it is an interpretation. Over time, interpretation hardens into assumption. Assumption becomes expectation. Expectation guides the decision. Decision becomes experience. And experience, repeated, becomes what you call life. This is not philosophy, it is a function. Your world reflects the dominant patterns of your mind, not what you intend in moments of clarity, but what you assume in moments of neutrality. What you consider normal, what you silently expect to continue. That expectation does not need to be conscious. In fact, its power depends on the opposite. The more automatic it becomes, the more reliable its results. This is why effort often fails to create lasting change. The effort tries to override the structure without first understanding it. But the mind does not respond to force, it responds to familiarity. It organizes reality around what it knows how to sustain. When inner patterns remain unchanged, external outcomes remain remarkably consistent, even when circumstances appear to shift. And this is not resistance, it is coherence. Your mind is doing exactly what it was designed to do, create a stable world that matches its internal order. The problem is not that your mind creates your world. The problem is that it does so quietly, without supervision, without awareness. And so the same themes repeat, the same ceilings appear, the same emotional landscapes return, wearing different names. This audiobook is an invitation to see that process clearly, not to control it, not to force it, but to understand it. Because once the mechanism is visible, it cannot operate in the same way. When the mind becomes aware of its own patterns, creation changes, the lens shifts, interpretation loosens, decisions change, and reality follows, not through effort, but through clarity. From this point forward, we will speak directly about the relationship between mind and world, about how inner structure becomes outer form, about how what feels like fate is often the result of unnoticed mental continuity. You are not waiting for creation to begin. Your mind has been creating your world all along. What changes now is that you are present to the process. And presence is the beginning of real transformation. Chapter 1. The mind is not passive. Most people believe the mind observes reality. They assume the world arrives first, and thought follows, reacting, interpreting, and coping. In this view, the mind is secondary, a witness, a commentator on events that exist independently of it. But this assumption is where the misunderstanding begins. The mind is not passive. It does not wait for reality to appear and then respond. It actively arranges experience before it becomes recognizable as the world. What you see, what you notice, what feels important, threatening, promising, or irrelevant, all of it is filtered through mental structure long before conscious awareness steps in. The mind decides what qualifies as real. This is not a poetic statement, it is a functional one. At every moment, the mind is selecting from an overwhelming amount of information. It determines what enters awareness and what fades into the background. It assigns meaning instantly without asking for permission. That meaning shapes emotion. Emotion shapes response. Response shapes behavior. And behavior, repeated, shapes the conditions you live inside. By the time you call something reality, the mind has already been involved at every level. This is why two people can experience the same situation and walk away with entirely different conclusions, emotions, and outcomes. The external event may be shared, but the internal process is not. The mind does not mirror reality, it constructs it. Over time, these constructions stabilize. Interpretations that are repeated become assumptions. Assumptions become expectations. Expectations become automatic. At that point, the mind is no longer reacting. It is predicting. And prediction is a creative act. What the mind expects, it prepares for. What it prepares for, it notices. What it notices, it reinforces. This loop is constant and it is efficient. The mind is designed to conserve energy. It prefers familiarity over exploration, certainty over openness. Once a pattern proves consistent, the mind will reuse it, even if the outcome is limiting. This is how inner structure becomes outer experience. A person who expects difficulty unconsciously scans for obstacles. A person who expects rejection notices subtle cues of distance. A person who expects scarcity interprets delay as confirmation. None of this feels deliberate. It feels like realism. But realism is often nothing more than familiarity mistaken for truth. The mind does not ask whether a pattern is helpful. It asks whether it is known. And once something is known well enough, the mind treats it as a stable reality. This is why change feels unnatural at first. Why new outcomes feel fragile. Why improvement often triggers discomfort rather than relief. The mind is not resisting growth, it is defending coherence. It wants the inner world and the outer world to match. When they do, the system feels calm, even if the result is unsatisfying. This is the deeper reason that effort alone rarely creates lasting change. Effort operates at the surface, while the mind's organizing patterns remain untouched. You can push against circumstances, but if the mental structure that produced them stays intact, reality reorganizes back to familiar form. This is not a failure. It is designed. The mind creates your world by maintaining internal consistency. Once this is understood, something important shifts. You stop asking why the world keeps happening to you, and you begin asking how your mind has been arranging it. Not through conscious intention, but through repetition, through expectation, through an interpretation that has gone unquestioned. This chapter is not about correcting the mind yet. It is about recognizing its role, because until you see how actively the mind participates in creating your world, any attempt to change reality will feel external, exhausting, and temporary. The moment you understand that the mind is not a passenger but an architect, the conversation changes. From this point forward, we will explore how these mental structures form, why they persist, and, most importantly, how awareness begins to loosen their grip. Because the world you live in is not something you are merely navigating, it is something your mind has been quietly building. And once you see that clearly, you are no longer at the mercy of appearances. You are at the beginning of understanding creation itself. Chapter 2, Inner Patterns, the Architecture of Reality. If the mind is the architect of experience, then inner patterns are its blueprint. They are not thoughts in the usual sense. They are deeper than that, more stable, more persistent. Thoughts come and go, but patterns remain. They organize thought, guide emotion, and shape behavior long before conscious intention becomes involved. An inner pattern is the way the mind expects life to behave. It is a set of assumptions about what is likely, what is possible, and what is inevitable. These assumptions are rarely stated clearly. They do not appear as deliberate beliefs. They feel like common sense, like realism, like just how things work. And because they feel obvious, they are rarely examined. Patterns form through repetition. Experiences that occur often enough, especially those charged with emotion, begin to leave an imprint. Over time, the mind links certain situations with certain outcomes, certain efforts with certain results, and certain identities with certain limits. Once this linkage stabilizes, the mind stops exploring alternatives, it stops asking questions, it predicts. Prediction is efficient, it saves energy, and the mind values efficiency above accuracy. This is where inner patterns begin to function as architecture. They define the invisible boundaries of experience. They determine which possibilities feel reachable and which feel unrealistic, even before evidence is considered. You may consciously say you want change, but if your inner patterns associate change with loss, instability, or disappointment, the mind quietly resists, not out of fear, but out of consistency. It is preserving what it understands. This is why people often feel torn between desire and hesitation. The desire is conscious. The hesitation belongs to an older structure. Inner patterns are not personal flaws, they are adaptations. Most of them formed in response to earlier environments, earlier roles, and earlier versions of self. At some point they were useful. They helped you make sense of the world, but usefulness does not guarantee relevance. As circumstances evolve, patterns often remain fixed. The mind continues to operate with outdated maps, interpreting new territory through old expectations. Reality then appears limited, repetitive, or unresponsive, not because it is, but because the architecture has not been updated. What makes patterns especially powerful is that they are self-reinforcing. A pattern creates an expectation. Expectation influences perception. Perception shapes interpretation. Interpretation guides behavior. Behavior produces results, and results confirm the original pattern. This loop can run for years without interruption. The mind then points to the outcome and says, "See, this is how it is." But what it is seeing is not objective reality, it is the echo of its own structure. This is how the mind creates a world that feels solid, predictable, and often inescapable. Consider how patterns shape different areas of life. In relationships, inner patterns determine what feels normal. Some people expect closeness to fade, others expect conflict to emerge, others assume they must overextend themselves to be accepted. These assumptions influence tone, boundaries, and behavior in subtle ways that invite familiar outcomes. In work and achievement, patterns set an internal ceiling. A person may strive, improve, and advance, yet feel an invisible line they do not cross. Success beyond that line feels uncomfortable, undeserved, or unstable. The mind then finds reasons to slow down, pull back, or redirect effort. In self-concept, patterns define identity. They determine what kind of person you believe yourself to be, capable or limited, lucky or overlooked, resilient or exhausted. This identity quietly informs every decision, shaping the trajectory of experience over time. None of this happens consciously. Patterns operate beneath awareness, which is why they feel like reality rather than interpretation. The mind does not say, "I am following a pattern." It says, "This makes sense." This is the critical distinction. The architecture of reality is not built from facts alone. It is built on meaning, and meaning is assigned internally, not externally. Two people can face the same circumstance and build entirely different worlds from it. One sees opportunity, another sees a threat. One interprets delay as redirection, another sees it as a failure. The difference is not intelligence or willpower, it is a pattern. Once established, patterns resist change because they are tied to identity. To challenge a pattern feels like challenging who you are. The mind protects identity fiercely, not because it is correct, but because it is familiar. This is why insight alone is often not enough. Understanding a pattern intellectually does not immediately dissolve it. The mind may agree with the insight while continuing to operate as before. Change begins when a pattern is not only recognized but felt. When you notice how a familiar expectation shapes emotion. When you observe how emotion influences choice. When you see how choice leads back to the same result. This observation introduces a pause, and in that pause, something new becomes possible. Inner patterns lose their absolute authority the moment they are seen as structures rather than truths. This does not mean they disappear instantly, but they loosen, they become negotiable, they stop being invisible. Once a pattern is visible, the mind can no longer pretend it is simply reacting to reality. It must acknowledge its role in organizing it. This is the beginning of real change, not by replacing patterns with positive ideas, but by understanding the architecture they create, by seeing how the mind has been building a world that feels consistent even when that consistency has become limiting. As we move forward, we will explore how emotion gives these patterns their strength and why some patterns persist despite conscious effort to change. Because the mind does not create your world through isolated thoughts, it creates it through structure, and structure, once understood, can be reconfigured, but first it must be seen. Chapter 3. Emotional energy, the force that gives patterns power. Inner patterns do not operate on thought alone. If they did, change would be simple. A new idea would replace an old one, and reality would shift accordingly. But ideas are light. They move quickly. They leave little trace. What gives a pattern weight, what allows it to persist, to organize experience with consistency, is emotion. Emotion is the binding force between the mind and the world. It is not merely a reaction to events, it is a signal, a charge that tells the mind what matters, what should be remembered, and what must be repeated or avoided. Without emotion, thoughts pass through awareness without consequence. With emotion, they imprint. This is why emotionally charged experiences shape us more deeply than neutral ones. The mind treats emotion as instruction. Fear says, remember this. Relief says, return to this. Shame says, avoid this. Anticipation says, move toward this. Over time, these signals form emotional habits, default states. The mind returns to when there is no immediate stimulus. These habitual emotional tones become the background atmosphere of a person's inner life. And the world responds to atmosphere, not intention. When an emotional state is repeated often enough, it begins to define what feels normal. The mind then organizes perception and behavior around maintaining that normality. This is the deeper mechanism behind manifestation. Reality does not respond to what you occasionally feel. It responds to what you rehearse. A person who frequently returns to tension, even in the absence of threat, begins to interpret neutral situations as demanding or risky. Their body prepares for strain, their attention narrows, their decisions become defensive. Over time, their environment reflects that inner state, offering circumstances that confirm it. Another person may carry a quiet expectation of disappointment. Nothing dramatic, just a low-level assumption that things eventually fall apart. This emotional posture influences how opportunities are received, how risks are taken, and how setbacks are interpreted. The world in turn seems to comply with that expectation. These outcomes feel external, they appear circumstantial, but they are aligned responses to an internal signal. Emotional energy gives patterns momentum. Without it, patterns weaken. With it, they endure. This is why positive thinking so often fails to produce lasting change. A new thought introduced into an emotionally familiar environment is quickly overpowered. The emotional tone remains unchanged, and the mind defaults back to what it knows how to sustain. Affirmations spoken without emotional congruence create friction, not transformation. The mind senses the mismatch and resolves it by returning to the dominant emotional state. This is not self-sabotage, it is coherence. The system seeks alignment between thought, emotion, and expectation. When alignment is missing, emotion usually wins because emotion is older, faster, and more deeply wired. Most emotional patterns were established early. Long before language became precise, emotion was already shaping interpretation. The mind learned what to expect from life by associating certain feelings with certain outcomes. These associations became internal rules, rules such as effort leads to exhaustion, closeness leads to loss, visibility leads to criticism, and success leads to pressure. Once established, these rules operate automatically. The mind does not question them, it enforces them. And because these rules are emotional, they do not feel like beliefs, they feel like instinct. This is why change often triggers discomfort. Not because it is wrong, but because it threatens the emotional equilibrium the system has learned to maintain. A new possibility may appear promising, but if it carries unfamiliar emotional tones, uncertainty, exposure, responsibility, the mind reacts with resistance. It seeks to restore emotional familiarity. This restoration may look like procrastination, doubt, distraction, or sudden loss of motivation. But underneath these behaviors is a simple mechanism, the emotional system pulling experience back into known territory. Reality then appears to resist change, but it is the emotional signal that has remained constant. To understand manifestation, then, is to understand emotional energy, not as something to suppress or manipulate, but as something to observe. Emotions do not need to be controlled to lose their power. They need to be recognized. When emotional patterns are brought into awareness, they begin to loosen their grip. Awareness introduces choice. You begin to notice when an emotional response is habitual rather than appropriate. You see the difference between the present moment and the emotional memory responding to it. In that recognition, the pattern weakens. This is the moment where the mind regains flexibility. The emotional signal changes and the system reorganizes accordingly. Interpretation shifts, behavior adjusts. Outcomes begin to vary, not dramatically at first, but consistently. This is the real work beneath manifestation, not the pursuit of elevated emotion, but the understanding of habitual emotion. Not the performance of positivity, but the observation of emotional repetition. When emotional energy changes, patterns lose their fuel. When patterns weaken, reality has no structure to maintain the old form. The world responds, not because it has been persuaded, but because the signal it has been receiving has changed. As we continue, we will explore how the subconscious preserves these emotional patterns and why familiarity often outweighs desire in shaping your experience. Because until the emotional engine is understood, the mind will continue to create the same world, even under new intentions. And once it is understood, the architecture begins to shift. Chapter 4. The Subconscious Preference for the Familiar. At the deepest level, the mind is not driven by desire. It is driven by recognition. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about how your world is created, because it contradicts what most people assume. We are taught that the mind seeks improvement, growth, and fulfillment, that it naturally moves toward what is better. In reality, the subconscious seeks what is known. Familiarity feels safe, even when it is limiting, even when it is painful. The subconscious mind is responsible for stability. Its primary task is not happiness, success, or expansion. It is continuity. It works tirelessly to maintain an internal sense of order, to keep the inner world consistent with itself. That consistency becomes a kind of gravity. Once an emotional pattern, belief structure, or identity has been repeated often enough, the subconscious adopts it as a reference point. This reference point becomes normal, and whatever falls outside of that normal begins to feel suspicious, unstable, or unrealistic. This is why people often sabotage the change they consciously want, not because they lack discipline, not because they are afraid in any dramatic sense, but because the change threatens coherence. A new level of success may require a new self-image. A healthier relationship may demand unfamiliar boundaries. Peace may require letting go of an identity built around struggle. To the subconscious, these shifts feel disruptive. It does not evaluate whether something is good for you. It evaluates whether something fits the existing internal model. If it does not fit, resistance emerges. This resistance is subtle. It rarely announces itself as fear. It appears as a distraction, delay, second-guessing, or loss of momentum. The mind begins to generate reasons, reasonable ones, for staying where it is. I'm not ready yet. Now isn't the right time. This feels risky. I need more information. These thoughts feel rational, but they are downstream effects of a deeper process. The subconscious is attempting to preserve the familiar emotional environment it knows how to regulate. This is how the mind quietly keeps reality within certain bounds. Familiar patterns create familiar outcomes. Familiar outcomes reinforce familiar identity. An identity anchors the entire system. The subconscious clings to identity with remarkable loyalty. If you have come to know yourself as someone who struggles, ease can feel disorienting. If you identify as someone who is overlooked, recognition may feel uncomfortable. If effort and exhaustion are central to your sense of self, flow can feel undeserved. The mind then unconsciously engineers situations that restore the familiar role. This is not a flaw, it is conditioning. The subconscious learned long ago what version of you fits the world you grew up in. It built strategies around that version, and it continues to operate as if those conditions are still present, even when they are not. Time passes. Circumstances change. But the internal reference point remains. This is why insight alone does not always produce change. You may understand a pattern clearly, yet still feel pulled back into it. The subconscious is not persuaded by logic. It responds to emotional familiarity. Change, therefore, must feel safe before it can feel real. And safety to the subconscious means predictability. This is where many attempts at manifestation collapse. They attempt to leap beyond the familiar without addressing the internal anchor that pulls everything back. The mind stretches forward briefly, touches something new, then retracts. The system resets. The world returns to its previous configuration. From the outside, this looks like failure. From the inside, it is a regulation. The subconscious is restoring balance. Understanding this shifts the entire conversation. You stop interpreting resistance as weakness and begin to see it as information. It shows you where familiarity still dominates expectation. Instead of forcing yourself forward, you begin to observe what feels unfamiliar and why. What emotional states feel unstable? What outcomes feel foreign? What versions of yourself feel unreal? These questions reveal the boundaries of your current internal world, and boundaries, once seen, can be expanded, not by force, but by exposure. When the mind is gently introduced to new emotional experiences, without pressure, without threat, the subconscious begins to update its reference point. What once felt foreign becomes tolerable. What felt tolerable becomes familiar. This is how real change occurs. Gradually, quietly, from the inside outward. The subconscious does not need to be defeated, it needs to be reassured. Reassured that new outcomes do not equal danger, that unfamiliar emotional states can be sustained, that identity can evolve without collapsing the system. As this reassurance takes hold, resistance softens. The mind no longer needs to pull reality back into old shapes. The architecture loosens. And when the internal reference point shifts, the external world follows, not suddenly, not magically, but inevitably. Because the subconscious is no longer insisting on the old version of reality. In the next chapter, we will explore where intervention truly happens, not through struggle, but through awareness. How simply seeing these processes begins to change them, and why awareness is the most powerful force in reshaping the world your mind creates. Because the moment the subconscious pattern is observed, it is no longer absolute. And that is where transformation begins. Chapter 5. Awareness, where creation begins to change. There is a moment in every process where force stops working, effort reaches its limit. Discipline tightens, motivation strains, and still the same patterns return. The world rearranges itself briefly, only to settle back into familiar form. This is not because change is impossible. It is because the point of intervention has been misunderstood. Change does not occur where you push hardest. It occurs where you see most clearly. Awareness is not passive observation, it is an active disruption. When a pattern operates unseen, it has authority. It moves automatically, organizing perception, emotion, and behavior without resistance. The moment it is seen, that authority weakens. The system pauses. Choice becomes possible. This is the overlooked power of awareness. Most people try to change outcomes directly. They attempt to correct behavior, replace thoughts, or control emotion. These efforts can produce short-term results, but they rarely alter the underlying structure. The pattern adapts and continues. Awareness works differently. It does not attempt to replace anything. It interrupts the automatic sequence. A pattern runs because it is unquestioned. Awareness introduces a question, not an intellectual one, but a perceptual one. You begin to notice when an expectation arises. You recognize the familiar emotional tone returning. You see the impulse to react, withdraw, or push. In that noticing, the sequence slows. The mind cannot fully automate what it is watching. This is why awareness feels subtle yet powerful. It does not confront the system, it exposes it. And exposure changes behavior at the root. The moment you observe an inner pattern without identifying with it, you create distance. That distance is not separation, it is perspective. And perspective allows reorganization. The mind, once aware of its own movement, begins to adjust. This is not a moral process, it is mechanical. Awareness alters the feedback loop. Instead of expectation leading directly to interpretation, there is now a pause. Instead of emotion immediately driving response, there is space. In that space, the mind has options it did not previously perceive. This is why awareness is more effective than control. Control creates tension. Awareness creates flexibility. When you attempt to control a pattern, the system senses a threat. Resistance increases. The subconscious tightens its grip, restoring familiar outcomes. When you observe a pattern, the system relaxes. There is no attack, no demand. The pattern is allowed to reveal itself. In doing so, it loses its invisibility. Invisibility is the source of its power. Consider how this plays out in daily life. A familiar emotion arises: impatience, doubt, resignation. In the past, it would have guided behavior automatically. Now it is noticed, not judged, not suppressed, simply recognized as a recurring state. That recognition changes the signal. The emotion no longer defines the situation. It becomes information about an internal habit. The mind adjusts its interpretation. Behavior shifts slightly. The outcome changes just enough to break the loop. This is how new realities begin, not with dramatic action, but with consistent awareness. Over time, awareness accumulates. Patterns that once felt inevitable begin to feel optional. Emotional states that once dominated begin to pass more quickly. Expectations loosen their hold. The mind becomes less rigid. This is not because it has been forced into submission, but because it has been understood. Understanding reorganizes structure. As awareness increases, the mind begins to update its internal model of reality. It realizes that the old pattern is not the only viable option. New responses become possible. New emotional tones feel tolerable. The subconscious, sensing less threat, allows these variations to persist, and reality follows, not instantly, but reliably, because the mind is no longer sending the same signal. Awareness changes the quality of attention. Attention changes interpretation. Interpretation changes behavior. Behavior changes outcome. This is the real mechanics of manifestation, not visualization, not repetition, not emotional performance, but sustained awareness of inner movement. Awareness does not demand perfection. It does not require constant vigilance. Even brief moments of clear seeing can alter the trajectory of a pattern. Each time a pattern is noticed, it weakens slightly. Each time it weakens, the mind gains flexibility. Each time flexibility increases, reality becomes less predictable and more responsive. This is why awareness feels like relief. Effort ends. Struggle dissolves. The system begins to self-correct. You are no longer trying to create a different world. You are allowing the mind to reorganize the one it has been creating all along. This is the turning point. From here forward, the question is no longer how to make change happen. It becomes how to remain present enough to notice what is already happening within you, because the moment awareness is present, creation is no longer unconscious. And when creation becomes conscious, the world your mind creates begins to change. In the next chapter, we will explore what happens when this awareness matures into alignment, and why effort decreases as reality reorganizes itself around a new internal order. Because once the signal changes, the response is inevitable. Chapter 6. Alignment. When effort gives way to order. There is a stage in change where pushing becomes unnecessary. Not because the goal has been reached, but because the system has reorganized. The inner structures that once required effort to override are no longer pulling in the opposite direction. Resistance softens. Movement feels quieter, more precise. This is alignment. Alignment is not enthusiasm. It is not intensity. It is not the emotional high that comes from believing something new. Alignment is coherence between inner structure and outer action. When the mind's patterns, emotional tone, and expectations begin to agree with one another, effort naturally decreases. Action no longer feels like a battle against gravity. It feels like a continuation. This is why aligned change often feels subtle at first. There is no dramatic surge, no internal declaration, just a noticeable reduction in friction. Decisions feel clearer, reactions feel less urgent, outcomes feel less surprising. The mind stops sending mixed signals. Previously, one part of the system may have wanted expansion, while another clung to familiarity. One part reached forward, while another pulled back. This internal contradiction required constant energy to maintain. Alignment resolves that contradiction. It does not eliminate challenge, but it removes unnecessary resistance. The mind no longer needs to defend an outdated identity or preserve an emotional environment that no longer fits. It begins to allow a new order to stabilize. This is when reality starts to reorganize in ways that feel almost incidental. Opportunities appear without being chased. Conversations shift tone. Circumstances adjust subtly as if making room. From the outside, this can look like luck. From the inside, it feels like relief. Alignment does not mean that you always feel confident or calm. It means that your inner responses are no longer working against your direction. Even doubt, when it appears, does not derail movement. It passes through without redefining the path. This is the difference between effort-driven change and alignment-driven change. Effort-driven change relies on willpower. It requires constant reinforcement. When attention lapses, the system reverts. Alignment-driven change relies on structure. Once the structure shifts, maintenance is minimal. The system supports itself. The mind prefers alignment. When inner patterns and emotional tone match current circumstances, the mind conserves energy. It does not need to correct, resist, or compensate. This conversation is experienced as ease. Ease is not laziness, it is efficiency. This efficiency allows action to become more responsive. You no longer act from pressure or urgency, you act from clarity. Timing improves, choices feel less forced. The world responds accordingly. This response is not mysterious, it is mechanical. A mind that is aligned sends a clear signal. Interpretation becomes consistent, behavior becomes congruent. Others respond differently, not because they have been influenced, but because the signal they are receiving has changed. Alignment alters presence. People sense when someone is internally divided. They also sense when someone is coherent. This coherence changes how interactions unfold, how trust forms, and how opportunities are extended. The environment mirrors internal order. This is why alignment is more powerful than effort. Effort is visible, alignment is felt, and what is felt shapes response more reliably than what is declared. Importantly, alignment cannot be rushed. It emerges gradually as awareness loosens old patterns and emotional familiarity expands. The mind tests the new configuration, allowing it to stabilize. During this phase, patience is essential. Not passive patience, but observational patience. You continue to notice internal responses, allowing them to recalibrate without interference. Interference, trying to accelerate outcomes, often reintroduces strain. The system senses pressure and may revert to familiar defenses. Alignment deepens when allowed to unfold at its own pace. This is where many people misinterpret progress. They assume that because effort feels lighter, they are doing less. In truth, the work has moved to a deeper level. The mind is no longer being corrected, it is being supported. As alignment strengthens, the outer world reflects it with increasing consistency. Results feel less volatile. Setbacks lose their emotional charge. Success does not trigger self-sabotage. The system has found a new equilibrium. This is not the end of creation. It is a new phase of it. The mind continues to create your world, but now with greater clarity, less distortion, and fewer unconscious interruptions. In the final chapter, we will bring this understanding together, not as a summary but as a perspective shift, a way of relating to your mind and your world that allows creation to remain conscious, responsive, and ongoing, because alignment is not a destination. It is the condition that allows creation to flow without resistance, and once it is established, the world your mind creates no longer feels like something happening to you, but something unfolding with you. Chapter 7. The World as an Echo. At some point, a subtle realization settles in. You stop seeing your life as a series of events that happen to you, and you begin to recognize it as a response, not a judgment, not a reward or punishment, a response. The world, in this sense, is not an authority. It is an echo. It reflects the dominant order of the mind that engages with it. This does not mean that every detail of your experience is consciously chosen. It means that the structure of your experience, the themes, the repetitions, the general direction, follows the internal architecture that has been shaping perception, emotion, and behavior over time. Once this is seen, the relationship between mind and world changes permanently. You no longer ask the world to prove something to you. You stop waiting for circumstances to justify inner shifts. You recognize that the outer world is downstream from the inner one. This recognition is not empowering in an emotional sense. It is stabilizing. Blame dissolves, not because responsibility is denied, but because the mechanism is understood. You see that life has been responding faithfully, even when the response was uncomfortable. The world has not been working against you. It has been cooperating with you. It has been matching the expectations you carried silently, the emotional tones you normalized, the interpretations you repeated until they felt unquestionable. Seen this way, the world becomes informative rather than adversarial. When something repeats, it is not mocking you, it is pointing. When something feels blocked, it is not refusing you. It is revealing a boundary. When something shifts, even slightly, it is not a coincidence. It is feedback. This changes how you experience. Instead of reacting immediately, you observe. Instead of interpreting quickly, you pause. Instead of resisting discomfort, you ask what internal order it is aligned with. This is not passivity, it is precision. Precision replaces force. You begin to notice that change no longer requires dramatic effort. Small internal adjustments produce measurable external effects. A softened expectation alters an interaction. A relaxed emotional tone opens space. A shift in interpretation redirects action. These are not miracles, they are corrections. The mind, once aware of its role, naturally adjusts its signal, and when the signal changes, the echo changes. This is the ongoing nature of creation. Your mind does not create your world once, it creates it continuously. Every assumption you leave unquestioned reinforces structure. Every moment of awareness introduces flexibility. You do not need to monitor every thought or manage every emotion. That would reintroduce strain. What matters is orientation, where attention returns when nothing is demanding it. Over time, that return point defines the world you live in. As this becomes clear, something unexpected happens. You stop trying to escape your current reality. You understand that it is not a mistake but a reflection of a previous configuration, and reflections can change, not through denial, not through opposition, but through reorganization. This is the mature understanding of manifestation. It is not about bending reality to your will. It is about aligning inner structure so that reality has no reason to resist. The mind prefers order. The world mirrors it. When inner patterns are rigid, the world feels rigid. When inner patterns loosen, the world becomes responsive. This is not optimism. It is mechanics. You are not meant to control creation. You are meant to participate in it consciously. From this point forward, the question is no longer whether your mind creates your world. That has already been answered by experience. The real question is whether you are willing to remain aware of what your mind is doing quietly, continuously, beneath the surface of intention. Because awareness does not end creation, it refines it. And refinement is how complexity becomes coherence. Your mind will continue to create your world. That is not optional. What is optional is whether that creation happens unconsciously, repeating familiar forms, or consciously allowing new structures to emerge. The world you see tomorrow will be shaped by the patterns you allow today. Not all at once, not dramatically, but inevitably. And once you understand that, you stop waiting for reality to change. You recognize that it already is. Final section. Conscious creation. There is nothing left to search for. By now, the mechanism has revealed itself, not as a theory, not as a promise, but as a lived process. The mind has never been separate from the world you experience. It has never been a passive observer. It has been the organizing principle all along. What changes at this stage is not information, it is a relationship. You no longer relate to your mind as something that must be controlled, corrected, or overridden. You relate to it as the creative instrument it is. Subtle, persistent, precise. And like any instrument, its influence depends on how consciously it is used. Conscious creation does not mean constant vigilance, does not require monitoring every thought or regulating every emotion. That would return you to effort, to strain, to the illusion that force produces order. Conscious creation is simpler than that. It is the willingness to notice where your attention settles when nothing demands it. To notice which interpretations arise first. To notice the emotional tones you return to without thinking. These are not small details. They are the settings of the lens through which reality takes shape. When awareness becomes steady, not intense, just present, the mind begins to recalibrate on its own. Old patterns loosen because they are no longer unquestioned. Emotional habits soften because they are no longer mistaken for truth. Expectations widen because familiarity no longer defines possibility. The system corrects itself. This is the quiet elegance of conscious creation. It does not impose a new world. It allows a different one to emerge. You may notice that outcomes no longer feel as dramatic as before. Extremes fade. Life becomes less volatile, less reactive. This is not stagnation. It is stability reorganizing itself around a clearer signal. From this stability, movement becomes intentional. You act without urgency. You choose without compulsion. You respond without losing yourself in reaction. The world responds in kind, not because it has been commanded, but because it is always reflecting the dominant internal order. When that order becomes coherent, reality aligns without resistance. This is not mastery over life, it is a cooperation with it. There will still be challenges. Patterns do not disappear entirely. They surface, they weaken, they reappear in subtler forms. But now they are seen. And what is seen no longer governs in the same way. Awareness remains the constant. Each time you notice a familiar expectation forming, you create space. Each time you recognize an emotional habit returning, you loosen its grip. Each time you pause before reacting, you allow a different outcome to organize itself. These moments accumulate, not dramatically, but decisively. Over time, you may realize that your life no longer feels like something you are enduring or chasing. It feels like something you are participating in, moment by moment, adjustment by adjustment. This is the lived meaning of the title you began with. Your mind creates your world, not once, not symbolically, but continuously. And now that creation is no longer hidden from you. There is nothing more to add, nothing more to force, nothing more to wait for. The process is already underway. What remains is awareness, quiet, steady, and honest. From here on, creation does not need to be dramatic to be real. It only needs to be conscious. And when it is, the world that unfolds around you will no longer feel accidental. It will feel coherent, because it will be shaped by a mind that finally sees itself clearly. This is not the end of the work. It is the point at which the work becomes natural. And from this point forward, whatever world you find yourself living in will no longer be a mystery. It will be an echo you understand.